Okay, welcome to Concept 2 Ecology Notes. We are going to be talking about the biogeochemical cycles. People also often refer to them as the nutrient cycles. You may just see them as geochemical cycles. But essentially, we're talking about all the same thing, and we're talking about the movement of a particular form of matter through the living and the non living parts of an ecosystem. So if you remember, an ecosystem is the community, so all the living things in a given space, plus all of the non living factors as well, like the precipitation, the temperature in the atmosphere, things like that. So, we're going to be talking about how different forms of matter move in and out of organisms, and then also just the atmosphere and soil and other things that are not necessarily living in an ecosystem. And in my class, we're just going to be looking at three main cycles. We're going to be looking at the water cycle, which some texts refer to as the hydrologic cycle. So I just want you to know those words together. The carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. There's also a phosphorus cycle you can look at. Some people also pull out the oxygen cycle on its own. We are just going to be looking at these three in this course. Now, these are kind of the big three, if you will. What's really important, you may hopefully remember this from physical science, since matter is not created or destroyed and Earth is a closed system, that means these essential nutrients must be continuously cycled because we only have as much hydrogen as we have and as much oxygen as we have and as much carbon and nitrogen as we have. And these are the building blocks for macromolecules and all of the things that you need to survive. So it's critical that they can cycle so that when an organism dies, all of the things that are inside of them aren't just wasted. Or as you're breathing out carbon dioxide right now, that carbon and those oxygen atoms aren't just wasted. They're being used and cycled over and over again. So that is why these cycles are so important, and we're going to talk through each one now. Okay, first the water cycle. We're going to start with this one because this should be the most familiar to you. You definitely should have covered this in elementary school and middle school as well. Now, a couple of things. We're going to look at the chemical form of each of these forms of matter, and then we're going to look at the stages, and then we're going to talk about how living organisms specifically impact the cycle, and then also how humans specifically impact each of these cycles. So hopefully that'll be a little bit of a deeper dive than just going through the stages like you may have done in other grade levels. Okay, so first an overview. Water is H2O. It's two hydrogen atoms bonded to one oxygen atom. We covered this in Concept 2 of Unit 1 Biology Basics. And water is necessary for the life processes of all living things. They all need water to do what they need to do to survive. Sorry, I was cleaning my glasses while I said that. So, where can we find, this is important. Water is always H2O, period. Okay, it can be solid as ice, it can be liquid, and it can be in a vapor form as a gas, but it's always H2O. That's really important because that's going to be different from the other cycles we're going to look at. Now, water is found in a ton of places. It's on Earth's surface, in oceans, lakes, rivers. 97% of all water on Earth's surface is actually in the ocean, which is crazy. And of the 3% that isn't salt water, which would be, so it's considered freshwater, 2% is frozen in glaciers, which is also crazy. There's also water underground. In groundwater, in something called aquifers, which we'll define a little bit later. It's in the atmosphere as water vapor and condensing in clouds, and it's in us. It's in all living things have water in them. Now, one key component, we'll highlight key components of each cycle. One of the key things to know about the water cycle is it is driven by the sun. The sun is a critical player here in making the water cycle happen. Without the sun, we wouldn't have evaporation, which is a key component of getting water back into the atmosphere. So the sun is critical. All right, let's go through the stages. Again, we're going to do this quickly because this should be the most familiar cycle for you. All right, precipitation. That is when water falls to Earth, usually as a liquid, as rain, sleet, but it could also technically be as solid as snow. Infiltration is then when some of that water seeps underground from the surface of the earth, so when it's absorbed into the earth. An aquifer is specifically an underground layer of rock that is permeable, and thus it can actually hold water, which is pretty cool. So it can be stored in aquifers. Now, not all water gets infiltrated. Some of it runs off. So if it doesn't get infiltrated, it will run along the surface of the earth and then eventually collect somewhere. Now, it could collect in, a pond, in a river. It could just collect in a puddle. If our old driveway at our house always flooded when it rained. So that was the result of runoff and not having a lot of ground that could absorb the water. So those are 3 key steps here. Now remember, there's no order to these because it's all happening all the time. It's a cycle. So that's important to note too. That's why I specifically bulleted these and didn't number them. Okay, the other half of the steps, evaporation. So how do we get water back to the atmosphere? Evaporation. The sun heats liquid water and it becomes vapor and it rises to the atmosphere. That's labeled by this up arrow. The direction of these arrows is really important as you're labeling your pictures. Now, another way it gets in the atmosphere is through transpiration. So this is when water rises back to the atmosphere as water vapor from plants. If you remember, when they have their stomata, which is how carbon dioxide moves into plants and oxygen moves out as photosynthesis is happening, but it's also how excess water gets released. If you remember from our energy flow unit, when we were talking about organisms like corn and cacti that have to conserve water more, we talked about their stomata and how they closed those to help prevent transpiration and retain water. So this picture is showing arrows coming from those trees and from grass going up to the atmosphere. And then last but not least is condensation. That's when water vapor condenses to form clouds in the atmosphere before precipitation would happen again. And those are the 6 stages I want you to know. Now, let's talk about the water cycle and living organisms. So living organisms in the water cycle, what do they have to do with each other? So all organisms take in water for nutrient transport, chemical reactions, diffusions. So they're all also eliminating water too. So like you're drinking water and you're peeing out water. That's all happening. Plants are also taking in water to do photosynthesis. And you may notice that like photosynthesis and eliminating water and drinking water were not part of the 6 stages. That's because they're just really on a small scale. When we were just going through those 6 stages, we're going through the 6 like broadest stages of the water cycle, but also know there are all these small ways that we impact the water cycle too. So remember, from cellular respiration, all organisms are releasing water as a waste product from cellular respiration as we break down glucose. There's water as a product. And then plants are taking in water in their roots to make sugar when they do photosynthesis. So just know that these are definitely happening. These are ways that organisms are interacting with water, but they're not necessarily big enough to be formal stages of the cycle. Okay, last but not least, for every cycle, we're going to think about how are humans participating. So like we said, we're drinking water, we're eating foods with water in them, we're peeing out water. How do we contribute to the cycle as living organisms? And then how do we also negatively impact the cycle? And so that's something I really want to think of as we consider just our impact on the environment, especially as we get into concept 4 later. So a couple examples of negative human impact on this cycle specifically. So deforestation. When we're cutting down trees and clearing land, we're decreasing transpiration. This can also increase runoff because you don't have the roots to absorb a lot of that excess water. Anytime we're using pavement and we're building and we're creating development, that's going to increase runoff and decrease infiltration as well. Pollution is definitely a factor, and this affects each of the cycles when we affect contaminating water. And then another thing I want to mention is eutrophication. So this is when a body of water becomes overly enriched with nutrients, and it causes excessive algae growth. Now, you might be thinking, why would it be bad to have excess nutrients? Well, this could happen when farmers are using a ton of fertilizers, which are packed with nitrogen and phosphorus, and then runoff happens, and those fertilizers get into the water system, a body of water. Now this water has so much nitrogen and phosphorus, it's off balance, and algae will grow like crazy, and that algae can then block light from getting in, which would affect other plants and animals that live in that aquatic ecosystem. And if plants can't get sunlight, they can't do photosynthesis. So they're not going to be creating oxygen, which is going to affect the animals that live there as well. Organisms are going to die. Decomposers have to break them down. And then that is going to create, decomposers are going to use even more oxygen, which is going to make there be even less oxygen for the living things there. So it's just a vicious cycle that just throws off the balance. That's what they're all nature is very delicate in how the balance of things and give and take. And so if that gets thrown off, it can really have a big impact. Okay, in class, we're going to pause and do an activity here because I don't want these notes to be this long. But again, for the sake of the video, I'm going to keep pushing through. But no, in class, we're going to stop between each of these cycles and just kind of practice them and process them and things like that. Okay, now let's talk about the carbon cycle. Carbon, you hopefully remember from Unit 1 Biology Basics, it is the basis of all organic molecules, all of our macromolecules, and is found in a ton of chemical forms. So, you know how water was just H2O the whole time in the cycle? Carbon is not that way. It can be a bunch of different things. It can be in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, CO2. It can be in the atmosphere as methane, CH4. It can be C6H12O6, glucose in plants. There are so many different forms it's taking chemically. So that's a really, really, really important note before we move deeper into the cycle. Okay, so where do we find carbon? Well, remember, it's the basis of all of our macromolecules, which are necessary for life: proteins, carbs, lipids, and nucleic acids. It is in our atmosphere, often as CO2, but can be in other forms as well. It's in minerals and rocks. It's in fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. It's in the organic or the living components of soil and aquatic sediment. So it's really, really everywhere. And that's super important. Now, let's talk through the main stages of the carbon cycle. First is photosynthesis. This is where plants are going to take in CO2. They're going to capture it. So notice the arrow bringing it down from the atmosphere into the plants and convert it to sugar, C6H12O6. Cellular respiration is going to do the opposite. So this is kind of a cycle within the cycle where organisms are going to ingest foods that have carbon in them, and then they're going to process those for energy. And then as a part of processing them for ATP, we're going to release CO2 back into the environment. So these will hopefully counterbalance each other. Now, I also have these arrows over the water with photosynthesis and cellular respiration because I don't want us to forget about aquatic ecosystems. Like there are fish and there are aquatic plants that are doing photosynthesis and cellular respiration as well. So that's really important to remember. Another step I mentioned was consumption. So that's that arrow going into the organism's mouth. It's when we're eating another organism for carbon. And that consumption has to happen then so that we can get the energy from those things when we break them down chemically in cellular respiration. Another step that's super important is decomposition. So this is when decomposers break down carbon from dead organisms and recycle it into the soil. So anything that's dying or decaying, that's going to go into the soil so that then it can be absorbed by plants and their roots and used in those organisms. But another way it can be used and recycled is through fossilization. So this is when carbon from once living things gets converted into fossil fuels, and it takes intense heat, intense compression, and lots and lots and lots of time. That is super important. Now, the reason that matters though, why does it matter if it's just stuck in the ground? Well, we dig those fossil fuels out of the ground, we harvest them, and then we burn them, and that returns CO2 to the atmosphere. So combustion is just any sort of process that involves burning because that's going to release CO2 into the atmosphere. So how do living organisms impact the carbon cycle? They impact it a lot. Decomposers play a critical role. This could be bacteria, earthworms, fungi. They're breaking down dead materials and returning nutrients like carbon to the soil. That is super, super important, their role in that, and bringing those nutrients back into the soil. Photosynthetic organisms like plants, algae, they're removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and converting it into simple sugars. And then, of course, everything that's doing cellular respiration, animals, plants, fungi, that are breaking down carbon-rich food, breaking down macromolecules to get energy in the form of ATP, that's also going to release carbon dioxide as a waste product. So those are just a couple examples of the really large roles that living organisms have. All right, last, let's think about humans and how do we participate. So yes, we're eating stuff. We're doing cellular respiration. We're breathing out CO2 all the time. These are definitely big ways we impact the cycle, but all animals are doing those things. The biggest thing that humans specifically are doing is combustion. We're using wood or fossil fuels, which are made of carbon. We're burning them, and that's causing a major increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is really important because combustion is human introduced. We're the ones that have introduced this. Yes, it can happen if lightning strikes something and that starts a natural fire. But like there aren't squirrels out there starting fires and burning fossil fuels like we are. So that is our really, really large contribution to the cycle. And it's adding a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere that wouldn't naturally be there if it wasn't for our contribution of this. Okay, again, in class, we would pause and do some stuff with the carbon cycle, but we're just going to keep pressing through to the nitrogen cycle. So this is probably the one you're least familiar with. But a couple of key things. First, nitrogen, like carbon, is taking on a variety of chemical forms. It's not like water that's just H2O. It's going to be a ton of different things. Nitrites, nitrates, ammonium, that kind of thing. And it's really important that this is going to kind of be the trickiest cycle for you because the majority of the cycle is just different chemical reactions that are converting nitrogen into different forms. It's not really things that you're not seeing like you can see combustion, things like that. So where do we find nitrogen? In the atmosphere, it is N2. It's two nitrogen atoms bonded together. This is referred to as elemental nitrogen or sometimes atmospheric nitrogen. Now, what's important though is that plants and animals cannot use nitrogen in this form. So if you remember, carbon is typically in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, CO2, but that's not a big deal because plants can take in CO2 and then convert it. That's what's different about the nitrogen cycle, is plants can't just take in nitrogen from the atmosphere and use it, so it has to be converted, and that's why so much of this cycle is converting nitrogen into all these different types of forms I've highlighted in purple here. Nitrogen also makes up two of our macromolecules. Nitrogen is in proteins and it's in nucleic acids. Nitrogen is also in fossil fuels, just like carbon, and then it's in waste as well, and in the soil, and especially fertilizers. Nitrogen has a key role in helping plants grow. So let's go through the main stages, the ones that I really want you to know. So first is nitrogen fixation. So this is when bacteria or lightning, which is crazy, lightning can do this, but bacteria in the soil or in water, they're converting nitrogen from the air or from water into forms that plants can use. So think of it as like we're capturing nitrogen and we're bringing it down to like earth level here to be used by plants. Another way that we can kind of like capture nitrogen, if you will, is through consumption. So one organism eats another and obtains nitrogen from it when it's like breaking down the proteins in that organism, that kind of thing. Now, a step from the carbon cycle is also here, decomposition. So decomposers like bacteria, fungi, earthworms, etc., they're breaking down dead matter and returning nitrogen to the soil. So that's a really important step as well. All right, now a new term, ammonification. This is when bacteria are converting nitrogen from waste, like urine and feces, into ammonia. Nitrification is when bacteria are converting nitrogen and ammonia then into nitrates and nitrites that can be absorbed by plants in their roots. And this is how nitrogen is getting back into plants, which is how it's going to get back into the food chain and eventually get back to us, which is really important. And then last but not least is denitrification. This is the opposite of nitrogen fixation. So we're going to convert nitrogen and ammonia and things back to N2, back to atmospheric or elemental nitrogen, so that then it can go back into the atmosphere. Now, one thing I want to show you is I love this picture because I love for you to see that this is, again, it's all still happening in an aquatic environment. There's consumption when fish eat plants and they're taking in nitrogen that way. Those fish are producing waste. They're producing urine and feces, which has ammonia, which will get some bacteria will convert that into nitrites and nitrates that then the plants can absorb again and use to grow. So this is just showing the nitrogen cycle on a small scale in a fish tank. That's happening. And so that's really, really important. Okay, living organisms. I hope you noticed every single step involves living organisms, which is really unique about this cycle. And specifically bacteria. Every single step, I started with the word bacteria. They are critical for converting nitrogen in different forms. Fungi and other decomposers also help break down nitrogen-rich waste and get it into the soil, but bacteria are the main players here. And then, of course, on a smaller scale, I should say, we are contributing by elimination to this cycle. But again, in terms of the main steps, bacteria and decomposers are our main players here. So human participation, like we said, we're eliminating and contributing that way. But our biggest way that we're negatively impacting this cycle is through the use of fertilizers. So fertilizers are artificial. There can be natural ones, like using manure, cow manure, to fertilize a field is a natural way to cycle those nutrients that are already existing. But I'm talking about artificial fertilizers, like the bags you buy at a gardening store or at like Lowe's or Home Depot for your garden. That's an artificial fertilizer that has a lot of artificial nitrogen in it to be added to the soil to make things grow well, and that can create a really high imbalance. And then if runoff's happening, like in the water cycle, that can bring that excess nitrogen into aquatic ecosystems and cause eutrophication, which we talked about. And then combustion. This is actually, it's not as big of an impact on this cycle as it is the carbon cycle, but because nitrogen is in fossil fuels, anytime you're burning a fossil fuel like coal, oil, or natural gas, you're also releasing excess nitrogen into the atmosphere as well. All right, I hope this helped introduce you to the biogeochemical cycles or the nutrient cycles, and I'm excited to do some activities with you about these in class.